and sniff, or try it and see, a phrase which I think for me exactly captures the experimental approach of the pioneering home recorders. Now, I say home, actually a variety of terms were used in the early 20th century: amateur, private, but homemade or just simple home recordings seems to have been the most common usage. And these recordings were made primarily on cylinders, and as with so many ephemeral artifacts, their survival rate is low and largely arbitrary, and access to digitized examples in public collections in the UK is fairly negligible. So I'll be drawing mostly on my own collection and concentrating on recordings made in England and Scotland between 1902 and 1918. And what I'd like to do really this morning is offer a whistle-stop tour, and I got that right, of the raw material, and ask some fairly basic questions. You know, how easy was it to make your own recordings? Who did it? What sort of music do people record? And what can these sources tell us about contemporary music making? We'll also have a chance to observe how the early adopters viewed this new technology, and how the first amateurs performed in a prelapsarian sound world, an innocent time, I think, before the dominance of studio recordings. As we'll hear, compared with the stand and deliver rigidity of many early commercial recordings, those made at home inevitably offer more personality and context. So this is an Edison home phonograph, this was the first phonograph generally available in the UK. This one still has its original brass license plates on the front there, which help us date it to 1897. And from the start, this machine and machines like it were designed really to record as well as play. And they all came with a recording head and built-in shavers as standard. And I put an arrow there to show the winding screw, which would press the, you can just see a cutter hovering menacingly above the cylinder. And I've used this original instrument to record most of the examples we'll hear this morning, and I've stood about 1 foot to 2 foot away from the horn using a small digital recorder. You didn't need much in the way of equipment to start recording. Blank cylinders of soft brown wax were widely available, and from about 1908, they were also offered in a slightly more durable, darker material. There's one from Clarion there, the second item there. And of course, most people reused their worn-out wax cylinders, shaving off earlier commercial recordings, either with their built-in shavers or, as we can see on the right there, with a dedicated machine. The Edison recorder, which was the go-to recorder at the time, changed very little over the years, except in 1912, when the 2-minute version was replaced with a 4-minute recorder, able to cut an extraordinary 200 tracks per inch. And of course, there was also plenty of practical advice for novices. I've been collecting these guidebooks, and we've got a selection here dating from 1898 to 1912. 3 things stand out from these for me: just how ambitious home recording enthusiasts were urged to be, the surprisingly detailed advice offered, and the constant encouragement to experiment. The Edison 1904 guidebook on the extreme left there reassures budding amateurs that making phonograph records at home may be compared to amateur photography. The first efforts are crude or disappointing, so care and persistence are necessary. Well, making vocal records was particularly popular, and the most oft-repeated advice to singers is, of course, that if a high or a loud note is sung, then you should slightly draw back your head from the horn to avoid blasting or distortion. The 1898 Edison Bell Guide, the second one in there from the left, also cautions that at all costs, avoid singing with too much expression. The point being, I think, that a performance with lots of dynamic shading and vibrato just didn't record as well as one with a more even tone, certainly in the home recorded domain. So here's the Edison 1912 guide, and it's full of useful photographs and specifics. Picking a few things out, the singer should stand not more than 6 inches from the mouth of the horn, a bit closer than we normally think. For duets, stand a bit further back, for a blend of vocal tone. And for the accompaniment, keep the phonograph at least 5 feet from the sounding board of the piano. And you can see in the picture there at the bottom right, also useful to take off at the front boards. Piano recordings were notoriously hard to make, and actually very few were commercially released early on, but strangely amateurs really persisted here. The main advice offered is to have the recording horn directed to the back of the piano, as we can see in the left-hand photograph, and on the treble side, and avoid using the pedals which tended to smear the sound. With melody instruments in the middle there, you should get as close to the horn as possible, and with string instruments, align the horn with the S hole. Though how practical that was with a cello is hard to know. The final paragraph on this page reiterates 2 really key pieces of advice. Songs with no long drawn out notes are easier to record, and it was desirable for performers to eliminate as much as possible any tremolo or vibrato in the notes. Now, I think one reason for both these suggestions is that sustained notes and vibrato tended to emphasize the natural wow and flutter of even the best regulated phonographs, leading to a slightly wobbly or wavery recording. This is the early 1904 Edison guide, and one of the most ambitious guidelines for home recording I've come across. The relative placement of the instruments on the right there is given by numbers, and you can see the key at the bottom, arrayed in front of the horn. Obviously, this was to achieve an even balance of sound in an acoustic recording. And the very detailed advice we get on the following page tells us that some of the players should sit, some should stand, and some should be elevated 2 or 3 feet, if you could manage it, and play across the bell of the horn. I must say, I mean, I've never heard an amateur band recording of anything like this scale, and I should think very few were actually attempted. But I think it does tell us a lot of what went on in the studios. That's another talk, of course. So what does the typical home recorded cylinder actually look like? Well, one quick way to spot them is their tendency to split up into lots of separate tracks, unlike commercial recordings.
21 today, I'm 21 today, I've got the key of the door, never 21 before. All the sister can do is a like a shouting in parade. I'm a jolly good sparrow, 21 today.
Yeah, Alec Kendall's I'm 21 today of 1911, so that gives us a nice starting point for that. And that was the middle track that you can see on the left-hand picture, the one that's picked out between 2 spaces there. Short home recorded tracks are also found in the unused wax at the beginning and ends of many commercially recorded cylinders. And this marginalia, you can see I've given an example on the right there with an arrow pointing. There's quite a substantial margin there. And the recordings made here can tell us often a lot about the original owners of the cylinders. And I found everything from adverts for felt roofing to tiny instrumental solos. Beautifully timed often, that they actually do fit, which says quite a lot about the experience of recording on every little fragment you've got. Well, other characteristic features of home recorded cylinders include a tendency to get gradually quieter as swarf builds up around the cutting stylus. Occasional sound dropouts are common, often caused by an uneven surface. And we also hear different volume levels and speeds within a single recording as people moved relative to the horn or the motor ran erratically or wound down. Poor shaving can lead to very rough skin, as we can see on the right there. Despite the fact that shaving attachments were fitted to all early Edison phonographs, they weren't always very effective. The motors of the early machines simply weren't powerful enough. And the 1904 Edison guide recommends several light shaves rather than one deep one. And I remember my father saying the same thing. If you go too deep, you get that sort of chipping we can see on the right. As for characteristic noises of home recorded cylinders, I think the most common fingerprint is when the recording starts before the cylinder has properly got up to speed, which in playback causes the pitch to slowly drop.
And it's a phonograph, they're going to have 3 cheers for the ladies. Hip, hip, hip,
Because you never know quite what you're going to get on a home recorded cylinder. Other characteristics, here we've got warping. The early guidebooks say much easier to record a cylinder if you warm it slightly in front of the fire. Well, a little overheating has gone on here. And this cylinder has also been too lightly shaved, which leads to bleed through from a previous recording, something generally referred to as ghosting. It's fascinating trying to listen to the earlier recordings if you can hear them. This particular cylinder has got songs, a variety of them, and over it, a 1936 recording, BBC News recording, reporting on the Spanish Civil War. And just at the point when it talks about General Franco doing something to alleviate the plight of the children, suddenly, from the underlying recording, you get childish laughter. It's quite extraordinary the synergies that these overlapping recordings can create. Next, I want to talk a little bit about experimentation. Edison Bell's How to Make Phonograph Records of 1898 begins by making the point that the secrets of a successful recording can only be discovered by experiments and experience. The writer then very practically suggests that in making tests, announce upon the record each change you try, so that the effect of each experiment may be traced when the record is played back. And there's really a lot of surviving evidence of this, which suggests that many early phonograph owners really did enjoy experimenting with recording, perhaps as much as playing back commercial cylinders. So let's hear a little bit of what they got up to. This is the Hindley family. They ran a successful phonograph business in Nottingham from about 1899, and they made a lot of fascinating recordings with the whole family. And of course, they had all the latest equipment to tinker with. That's Arthur in the picture on the left, and his son Harold, who with his brother Albert was probably responsible for this Edison recorder test made around 1910. It's a shame we don't actually have a bit more information about which particular Edison recorders they were using, but we can certainly hear the difference.
What makes you so sleepy around the office? It's my sense of duty, boss. Oh, I lie awake too much at night thinking about my work. What makes you so sleepy around the office? My sense of duty, boss. Oh, I lie awake too much at night thinking about my work. This record is made to test the efficiency of an Edison recorder. This record is made to test the efficiency of an Edison recorder. I hope shortly to have the pleasure of recording the
And we shall never know. Again, absolutely classic denial of expectation in early home recordings. By 1915, the Hindley family had the latest Aeolian Vocalion gramophone. It had one of the earliest remote controls, the Graduola, and they made several recordings singing along to this, using the remote control to adjust the volume to get a good balance. So let's hear Mrs. Hindley singing the 1918 hit, Till We Meet Again. And she's a wonderful, rich contralto, and it's a voice type heard on a lot of early domestic cylinders, but much rarer, I think, today. just the very end, if you listen really carefully, she actually goes, so it's those lovely little subtle touches occasionally which are so revealing. So Edwardian karaoke. Singing with the gramophone seems to have been a fairly popular domestic entertainment, as was communal singing. I picked up this next cylinder actually for a £5 at Portobello Road Market a couple of years ago. It's helpfully dated the 11th of December 1918, and we hear a group of friends getting together to sing Three Blind Mice. So often, of course, one singer doesn't stop at the point that they're all meant to, and of course carries on for a bit, and lots of laughs. But the real purpose of the recording is revealed then. It's an experiment recorded through the large trumpet. The speech which follows then apparently uses a small horn. I'm going to save you from the opening of this. We'll start halfway through.
That awful noise was taken in the large trumpet. It's an experiment. The rest is in the small trumpet. Well, I hope the neighbors won't object to all this noise. Hitherto, this has been a respectable abode. A rotten show, throw 'em out! Are you ready for the chorus, Pringle?
We can tease quite a lot of information from this recording, but I think one of the most important things is that experimenting with the apparatus itself could be a communal entertainment. Well, I had no idea really how varied home recordings were until I actually started to collect them. And this slide shows just a small cross section. We've got some communal singing from the Waverley Minstrels, who have a go at Gilbert and Sullivan choruses. There's a location recording there in the middle, Church Bells Pealing the New Year in 1904, recorded by Mr. Wall from the Road, it says there. Piano recordings turn up a great deal, and there's something perhaps for an entirely different talk. Original compositions also, this is a very fertile area. This one is a short voluntary or part song or impromptu played by and composed by Henry Cromwell Wall, 14th of June 1903. Of course, Christmas cylinders were so popular. You've got the whole family and friends assembled at home, so why not have a bit of communal singing and fun in front of the horn? And at other times of the year, phonograph parties were held. Again, friends and family were asked to perform in front of the horn and do their party pieces. And it often goes hand in hand with a personification of the phonograph. The phonograph is often involved in the conversation and addressed as Mr. Phonograph or something else. And there are also serious musical and commemorative and documentary recordings, often very carefully recorded and with a clear ear to posterity, certainly within the family. And you can tell the ones that are rushed off and the ones that are done with real care, often on fresh cylinders. Competitions are very popular. By the 1910s, actually, record companies and retailers had begun organising competitions for the best home recordings of vocal and instrumental music. Of course, I think it was a way to promote the sale of blanks, but of course it also disseminated good practice because it was issued, the instructions that were issued were well laid out. Local musical competitions also provided a good reason to get out the phonograph, to keep a record of a prize winner in the family, like Master Henry Wall here. And you can just see Leslie Wilberforce Wall, aged 7.5 years. Is that something like Adrian Mole? Was he very, very happy with his extra half year? Anyway, there he is, commemorated there. And more so here, because here's the Wall family in 1904, and there's Leslie in the middle. I have to say, when we get to the First World War, it's so heartbreaking what the cylinders reveal. He's surrounded here, though, in happier times, surrounded by the whole family. His father, Cromwell, is on the right. He was a civil servant. Minnie, his mother, and the children, 9 of them, outside Lyndale in Parkhurst Road, in what was then the North London suburb of New Southgate. And the walls really are gold dust. About 20 or so of their home recorded cylinders have survived, covering a wide range of enthusiasms. We've Pealing Bells, compositions by Cromwell himself, an annual Christmas record, and with it we have the kind of historical context and detail which allows us to maximize the value of their recordings. The cylinder lid of one of their recordings from 1902 reads, "Angels from the realms of glory sung at the Oaks, 25th of December 1902 by the whole family." The Oaks was Cromwell Wall's parents' home in Barnet, and throughout their annual Christmas cylinders, we actually hear the family able to sing in 4-part harmony at the drop of a hat. I mean, it probably wasn't that uncommon, especially amongst regular churchgoers. This rendition of Angels from the Realms of Glory uses an unfamiliar setting, unfamiliar to me. I've not tracked it down yet. I'm afraid the recording has aged very badly, but we still can just about make out the fact that there is some confident close harmony going on. Well, Cromwell Wall was a very keen amateur recorder, and he used this machine, a Columbia Grand Graphophone, which didn't use the small 2-inch cylinders, but was equipped instead to play and record on 5-inch diameter concert cylinders. They offered much higher fidelity. They spun at 160 RPM, but much more wax was going underneath the recording stylus, and so the indentations are further spaced out. And this really leads to quite surprisingly high fidelity recordings, particularly of the piano. This is a classic commemorative recording featuring Cromwell's sister Ellis. I think she was about 17 or 18 at the time, and just as you can see there, poised to leave for New York. Her playing is fairly accomplished, and we get a few background noises, which suggest that, as the box says, this was recorded at an informal family gathering. But just listen to the actual tonal quality of this recording. Well, apart from a bit of blasting there from the bass, I mean, the tonal colour there is extraordinary, isn't it, for 1902, and certainly an amateur recording. Commercial companies obviously steered fairly clear of the piano early on, but amateurs, as I said earlier, really did persist, and they're the most popular of the solo instrumental recordings I found, closely followed by the concertina, the mandolin, and the banjo, which all recorded very well acoustically. The violin turns up occasionally, but I've never found a cello yet. The majority of home recorded cylinders that I've come across are of unaccompanied singing. It's the simplest form of music making. It was much the simplest way to get someone in front of a horn. And one can hear everyone from uninhibited children to highly polished adults singing everything from nursery rhymes to opera arias. Folk song recordings are particularly interesting when they have the ring of the oral tradition. And again, that's a talk for another time. But I think when we listen to this, you'll hear what I mean. This is clearly an untrained voice with an accent. And the recording preserves an otherwise unknown, undocumented variant of Down by the Riverside. Some home recordings, like this one, followed commercial practice and began with an announcement. Because they come at the very beginning, they're very easy to wear off with misplaced stylus. And of course, you often shave off the very first moment or two. We do have his name, but I'm sure he introduced Down by the Riverside. So let's listen.
Sung by Ben Robinson. Down by the riverside I swim, as twilight shadows flow, and the soft music of the spring flows nature's glory falls. Beside the stream a maiden dwells, gathering the eventide, till as the water lily bell, till as the water lily bell, till as the water lily bell, down by the riverside.
I think old Ben was recording himself here, because actually later on, towards the end of the last verse, you get end of cylinder anxiety, which is where he's clearly looking at the cylinder and thinking how much more he's got to sing, so he speeds up. He still doesn't manage to get there, but it's a lovely artifact of home recordings. Well, in contrast to this kind of earthy rawness, many home recordings do preserve considered performances which have all the polish of rehearsed party pieces, and even star turns by local celebrities. Let's hear one of these by Charles McKenzie from around Glasgow, who recorded a laughing song in July 1902. Laughing songs were the stock in trade, of course, of musical performers, and McKenzie sounds as though he's performed this a few times in public. He certainly mastered the art of the theatrical laugh. The slightly thin, reedy sound wheel here is typical of the earliest Edison recording heads, which used glass diaphragms.
Laughing song by Mr. Charles McKenzie. I do not love the man of steel who goes enough with taste of the youth, who frowns at father near the Jew, and seeks the soul of the folk. The man who wears a happy face is tested with a better grace, and pure cheerful sounds there are, then such a man's bright ha 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 Now do you not with me agree that laughter is a remedy for many ills and pains and smarts, and cure for sorely aching a heart? If you are sad or in distress, a hearty laugh will ease you best. You will not find my advice amiss if you will take an like this.
Well, bless him, and another 7 verses. He's terrific. He obviously is a polished performer. Well, I'd like to move from Glasgow to Edinburgh now, and a cache of 26 cylinders recorded between 1903 and 5, which were recovered from a skip in the city in 2015. Most of the recordings are of boy trebles singing songs and liturgical music. We don't know who made the recordings, but they were serious about it. And many of the cylinder boxes are carefully labelled with both the name of the choir boy and the precise date of the recording. Several churches are mentioned on the recorded announcements, with most boys coming from the choirs of St John's, Edinburgh, and a few from the inner city Christchurch, Morningside, and St Peter's. And I've asked myself, why were they recorded? And I think largely it's to keep a record of the unbroken treble voice. It's something that does recur quite often in home recorded cylinders by enthusiastic parents. But the liturgical items, like the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, are chanted very seriously and together virtually constitute a travelling liturgy kit. And I wonder whether they were in fact used to play sections of the liturgy to the housebound. And that would help explain why in the same set there are spoken sections of the liturgy on cylinder and even chimes, bell-like chimes. In terms of their importance, as far as I know, and I look forward to being corrected on this, there are very few recordings of named choristers before this, 1903, 1904. And the first commercial recording of Anglican chant wasn't issued until 1908. So these recordings take us a long way back and offer, I think, uniquely informal and candid insights. We'll hear a few. They also offer glimpses of alternative performing traditions. I mean, away from the concert hall, the speed and shape of arias from Messiah, for example, are governed by natural breath lengths and the direct expressive simplicity of youth, largely innocent of contemporary fashion. Made in 1904, this recording, I think, could almost have been made yesterday. Listen, he has a bit of a breakdown shortly after that, but I think I want to commemorate this chap. He's unnamed, this one, in the good bit. Well, one of the most striking voices to emerge from these boys' cylinders is that of Willie Redpath, and you can see his cylinders there. 4 of them, mostly simple chanted items for evensong, which may not be very interesting musically, but they do display Redpath's steady tone and fine breath control, and the confident use of his chest register.
The Nunc Dimittis, sung by Willie Redpath of St John's Church, Edinburgh. Lord, now let us allow thy servant to depart in peace. According to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation.
When these boys turn to popular songs, they often modify their technique. And we're going to listen to young Master Gordon, who's enjoying experimenting with vibrato, portamento, and rubato in the final chorus of Bluebell, which was the hit song of 1904 about a soldier leaving his sweetheart.
Lift
It's interesting. I mean, I've listened to most of the 1904 commercial recordings issued of this, and none of them use quite such a sentimental palette. One of the unique opportunities offered by home recordings is the chance to observe critical attitudes to mistakes. And with Gordon and Bluebell, there are previous recordings in the collection which suggest that listening back critically actually sharpened his ear for detail and actually increased his appetite for sentimental inflection. My final music example from this lot, November 1903, and the Patterson brothers record a couple of verses from the well-known heroic aria, "Yes, Let Me Like a Soldier Fall," from William Wallace's opera Maritana. They do it in unison, which is tricky to bring off with perfect alignment. The first verse goes smoothly, but their concentration flags in the second, and the younger brother enters on the wrong note. This is the one we're going to hear, and stumbles a bit, and there are, of course, momentary pauses for stifled laughs, and who wouldn't? And throughout, though, you can hear the older, more experienced brother leading and keeping things going. And at the very end, they hit a low note flat, you'll hear it, and then they overshoot the climactic top notes. And they clearly clock these mistakes. You know, they understand what they've done, but they do hold their nerve and manage to finish together on the right note, roughly in tune. So there's evidence here of solid choir training, sensitivity to pitch, certainly with the older brother, George, clear experience of public performing, and I think experience dealing with the new medium of recording. Just, I mean, real laughter at last. But isn't that, I mean, I think there should be more laughter like that at the end of commercial recordings. Anyway, that's just a whistle-stop tour through the nature of home recordings. No big conclusions to draw there, but I think it's a good nuts and bolts outline. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Simon, for this such a rich paper with lots of examples. And obviously, I imagine hours, months, years of research. While we give maybe some time to people on YouTube to write their questions on the chat, or people in the room to think about a question, I wanted to make a comment, which is in my own research about commercial recordings, something I found quite striking is like how quickly conventions and formats get fixed. You know, obviously there's the announcement, there's this sort of self-contained piece, which sometimes they had to shorten, but it's like a self-contained thing. And then there's an applause, and then obviously the announcement and the applause are dropped, but that format stays the same. And obviously there are lots of improvements in terms of the sound quality and so on, but the format stays the same. And it seems in home recordings there was much more experimentation with formats, but maybe not so much. They weren't so worried perhaps about quality and so on.
Yes, I think, I mean, the social context in which different home recordings were made was so multifarious. And this is fascinating, and you genuinely get a window onto people's sitting rooms at home, you know, with the piano, with mother singing contralto, with the gramophone. But also you get that moment where they want to record their eldest son's voice before it disappears, the treble voice. And clearly there were lots of budding performers who and local celebrities who want to do an announcement like Mr. Charles McKenzie and puff themselves up, and they're definitely there's definitely a sense of aping the commercial release, I think, with things like with recordings like that. It's often, I find, you get a conventional open, you might get the announcement of title and performer, you get a complete performance. Often the most interesting thing is what happens next. And obviously that's why I let the last cylinder run on to the laughter. But you often get chuckling. You often get parents saying, well done, we told you to try again. And there's a great deal, the margins are very rich.
Yeah. Also, now that you mentioned the fact that they recorded the song's voice before it changed, it reminds me of, so when as you will all know, when the phonograph was first released, there was a lot, this strand which said, well, it will be useful to record the voices of loved people in our lives before they die, and then it's like a sort of memento. So, and obviously then this idea disappears, you know, once music starts being recorded, it's about music, it's not about, you know, preserving the voice of the dead. But that's an example of how this idea perhaps was kept, you know, obviously not different, it's not, you know, it's preserving the voice of someone who doesn't exist anymore as a boy, but exists as a man, perhaps. So
yes,
it's quite interesting.
But in fact, I mean, I haven't obviously talked about speech recordings today, and there's an extraordinary sense, actually, very particularly early on, so from 1899, perhaps 93-4, of capturing at Christmas the voices of all the older people in the family. And there's one glorious Christmas cylinder from the Hindley family, which begins with someone ancient who's not identified, who says, "This is the last Christmas of the 19th century." And and suddenly you think, God, it sort of brings it home to you. And there's a sort of innocence about the way in which people confide in the phonograph. And you get some really quite intimate things. There's one chap I didn't play who was doing a test for his Edison reproducer. And then he says, "I'm at home with influenza." The 1st of January 1902, and you know, and it's these extraordinary insights. And again, there's a long speech from a soldier on one cylinder who survives the Battle of Passchendaele, and in 1917 records his experiences of being rescued. And at the end of 2 minutes of this, suddenly he sings. And he sings to his fallen comrades, and it's incredibly moving. I mean, it's a very short piece of music, but of course you've got all this speech that the context is incredibly rich. And so quite a lot of material is embedded with this context, particularly, I mean, for researchers looking at the playground culture and nursery rhymes, and a great deal of stuff that has never been written down, but was part of the child's oral tradition is there. Fascinating.
Any other questions, Inya?
I have, this was stunning. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. I loved it. I have actually a couple of questions which are really technical. I love the catalogs you presented. They're fantastic. They're mind-blowing. But I noticed that in the catalog, in the pictures, and if it's a drawing or a picture, it doesn't have a photo. It seems like the recording form is the same as the form we would use nowadays to project or to play, reproducing form. So was that a common thing? Did they change funnels? Did they change forms or no?
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
I think earlier on, there seemed to be the use of a smaller horn for speaking, and a speaking tube would have been used.
Yes.
And larger horns would have been, straight horns would have been used for music. And I think they weren't that expensive, and I should think families probably had a couple. And later on, the pictures show a wooden, a very nice sort of wooden horn. It has a name, and it was so well built but it didn't have the kind of resonances that a tin horn had. So in a way, the sort of focus of sound you could get from a tin horn, good though it was not as good as a horn that was much more solid and wouldn't have extraneous resonances. So I think it's a Music Master horn. In fact, that's what's on. It's an Edison Triumph, I think, in the pictures with a wooden Music Master horn, and they were the best. They were the hi-fi horn.
Okay, because we had a lot of problems when we were doing the phonograph recordings in the last symposium with the cellists, if you remember. And the only horn which was actually okay because of the nature of the piece Kate was playing, it's just every horn we had resonated so much that it came to the sound distortion.
Yes.
And then the only horn we could use was the reproducing horn, and that was brilliant.
Yes.
And her recording was actually the loudest. So I was thinking, like, well, maybe I got it wrong, but yeah, that's really interesting.
We think, I mean, certainly later on when those bigger horns came in, signet horns, they seem to be very popular. It was much easier to stand in front of that sort of thing than a more pointy horn. The voice wasn't. Didn't diffract the voice and put you off. As for a cello, I think they are quite hard to record, all bass instruments.
Super, thank you so much. The second question I have is very specific again. I noticed when I did research on block cylinders, when I had an opportunity, because the City of London Phonograph and Graphophone Society to travel to St. Petersburg and to look at the cylinders, that they were all different colors, and they were basically very different in quality throughout the years, because block recorded for really a long period of time. So you had a color from really, really pale beige to really dark brown, like super. So I wanted to ask you, so obviously Edison was selling those blanks as a thing. Do you know anything about the production? In a way, where did these people buy those cylinders? Were they presented as, oh, change formula or something? Because of course, Faxel change color depending on the batch or something. But did you come across any commercials about actual blanks?
I mean, I think I showed on my slide that there are lots of different. Edison had about 4 different boxes. At least there were more. But there's whereas commercial cylinders often say something like new process. There's nothing like that I've seen on blank cylinders, except from about 1908, when a number of companies, including Edison and Clarion in the UK, brought out a black cylinder on a sort of, it was similar to the gold molded cylinder that was used commercially. It was harder. But the earlier wax cylinders I think there was very little consistency. And I think they of course used stearic acid. Duncan Miller knows all about this, but I think they were probably a bit hit and miss. I think some would have been a bit softer than others, and I think the colour was probably the last consideration. And I think they probably all aged in slightly different ways. And Pathé cylinders are notorious for having aged in a very bad way because of the components used, and they do change colour. So there's no, apart from the 1908 moment where we get a different material and a different colour, there's nothing much earlier that I've seen, though I should think there are some adverts out there that claim miraculous things.
They were all very size.
Yes. I
measured each one of them.
Yeah.
So they're all different sizes.
Yes.
And it's really unbelievable that even that size was not uniform.
Edison, I think the American production lines, Edison would have been more consistent, but it's difficult to know where those cylinders came from, and they probably weren't shaved down commercial issues, I imagine, but who knows?
Thank you so much.
Thanks to you.
Barbara.
Simon, thanks very much. It was really fascinating. I was thinking, these people who made home recordings really treated the recording, the gramophone, as another way of making music at home.
Yes.
Whereas I always thought that before the advent of recording, the only way of having music was playing and singing. So you needed an instrument or someone somehow trained to play and sing. And these people seem to approach the recording as another way of making. So I was wondering, is there a golden age of home recording? From a certain point onwards, it dies out.
Such a good question, Barbara. I think the trouble is that survival of these things is very sporadic. What one sees is because we know all phonographs by Edison were issued with a recorder head, a standard, and a shaver, that everyone was doing it quite early on, so from the mid-1890s. And what we get is greater survival as the actual cylinders that were made are slightly more robust. There are certain points where the trade journals tell us useful things, like I think it's about 1915, Clarion Records put an advert saying lots of soldiers coming back from the front have been demanding blank cylinders to record their voices onto their loved ones. And that's quite interesting, and it's quite a that's obviously quite a big historical moment to pin things on. Not that many of these have survived, from what I can gather, but I think in terms of a real golden age, it's longer than we think. So most of the things that I discover are probably between about 1902 and 1920, but there are an awful lot of recordings made much later, into the 50s even. And we know that because collectors sometimes write on them, and because there were moments when that was the only thing that they had to record on. And I think it's the family heirloom, and you bring it down from the loft in the Second World War, and you start listening to what's been recorded, and you add. So there are groups of cylinders which have recordings from before the First World War, including the First World War, and even into the 1940s. The most recent I found at auction were a series of cylinders made in London to capture the very final flight of Concorde. Actually acoustically recorded from someone's garden. No, not the golden age, but nevertheless to show that that recording technology was still working. And I think there's a sense of fascination amongst a certain sort of hi-fi group or people interested in these things, just to show that it did still work. And I mean, when did magnetic tape come in? I mean, not really for general use for quite a long time. So for many families, until the 50s, certainly 60s. So some families were still using and making wax cylinder recordings up until, including the 50s. Golden age, 1900 to 1918.
And we have one question on YouTube, which I'm going to make it the last question. That's Jean-Baptiste Masson, and he asks, from the 1950s, home recordists with tape recorders gathered themselves in clubs in France, Britain, Switzerland, etc. Was it the case at the end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century? Were there any such clubs of amateur recordists?
Yes, absolutely. And the City of London Phonograph and Gramophone Society was going for 100 years almost without break, and they had lots of local offshoots. So yes, they were, and there's some of the records of these meetings are fascinating and detailed. But I think that's not an area we know that much about. The bigger